Hello friends, welcome to Drishti and I am Anand. Friends, today in this video, we are going to discuss in detail about some concepts which you would be very much interested to know. And of course, all the details and the depth. So, we bring before you the concepts of national income, a very important concept with regard to the prelims as well as the mains. In this video, we shall be looking at the concepts of the GDP, the definition of GDP, the concepts of GDP at factor cost, GDP at market prices. We shall look after the concepts of the real GDP and nominal GDP. We shall look after the concepts of the GNP, the concept of NFIA, which is net factor income from abroad. Then we shall come to the concept of NNP, and at the end the national income and per capita income. So in this whole video you would be very much clear after the video about how do we calculate the national income, what are the components, what are the additions, subtractions from the various parameters to arrive at the national income, as well as who calculates, who publishes the data for GDP and others. So friends, let's begin the discussion, and before we begin, we must understand few concepts like the concept of territory. We must know the concept of the goods, in which we should know the concept of intermediate and final goods, and also we shall first look at the concept of the base year. After having known these concepts, it would be very much easy to understand the concept of the GDP. So let's begin with the concept first called a territory. When we talk about the national income, when we talk about the production in a country, so what does a country here refers to? What is the meaning of that territory for which we are desiring to calculate the income? So first of all, we have to look at the concept of the territory. Suppose we talk about the production in India. What is India all about? Suppose I make a map. I have a physical boundary of India which extends from north to south and east to west. But along with this physical boundary, we have the territories of Andaman Nicobar, which is also India. We have Lakshadweep, which is also India. But apart from these territories, in which areas do we expect the production would be counted in the production in India? Suppose we have a military base in some other country. Suppose we have some enclaves in some other country. Suppose we have the embassies of India located outside the country. These all territories also represent India, and everything produced in these territories, the economic value of those goods and services produced in these territories along with this part of India would also be looked as the production in India. Along with these areas, suppose I talk about there is a floating ship in the ocean. The ship belongs to a company based in India, and that ship catches the fish and exports from the high seas Is it not representing India? Of course it is. And that is why the moving vessels, may it be the shipping vessels or it may be the aircrafts or the jets, wherever the production is taking place, wherever economic activities are being taking place. So all these areas, including the India's land borders, the physical contiguous borders, Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweep, military bases, enclaves, embassies, as well as the moving vessels, they all represent the India's economic territory, and production in all these areas would be a part of India's production, India's gross domestic production. Now, moving ahead, what would be the goods all about? Say, goods are any objects which are useful for our daily lives, and we have two types of goods that we use or we tend to produce. Suppose we produce steel, then from the steel we produce a car. We produce yarn in the textile companies, factories, then we produce the shirts. We have the production of the food grains, then we have the production of the processed food. What are the similarities and the differences in these products? If you look at the steel, steel is a good, it's a product, but it is not yet ready for the final consumption. It is an intermediate good because this would be consumed in the process to produce a car. Suppose we talk about yarn. Yarn is not a final commodity. It is a commodity which would be used in the production of the textiles or the shirt. So suppose I talk about steel. Steel is a good, but it is an intermediate good because this is used in the process of production. It is not to be finally consumed by the consumers or the final users. Similarly, coming to the shirt, shirt is something which is now ready for the consumption, for the usage, and that is why shirt is a final commodity. Now, so we have to understand two things here: steel and car, intermediate and the final goods. While we talk about the production in the country, which of the goods should we take, intermediate or say final? Suppose I take the value of steel produced in the country, then again I take the value of car produced in the country. Is it not leading to the double counting of the same commodity? And that is why we have to understand that whenever we talk about the production in the country, to avoid the problems of double counting, to achieve at the right figure, we should talk about only the final goods, not the intermediate goods. So first, in order to understand the concept of GDP, national income, we must understand that we have done about the territory, then about the goods, in which we have to talk about the final goods. Let's proceed to the definition of GDP, then we shall come to the concept of base year. We start with the concept called the gross domestic product, commonly known as the GDP. What is the GDP all about? You see, I define the GDP into main points. The sum total of monetary value of all final goods and services produced in an country's territory in a given financial year is actually called the gross domestic product of that country or the territory. Let's see the definition word by word. Suppose we talk about production in India. So in India, we had production of milk in liters, production of steel in say tons, production of X in say numbers 1000X. How do we add them up? We have no other, we don't have any measure to add the quantities in the different units. So what we do, we convert the total production into their monetary value by multiplying with the prices which are prevailing. Suppose we want to add the production of milk to production of X. What we do? We convert milk into liters from milk into rupees. We convert steel into tons to steel into rupees, and then we also convert the number of X into the number of rupees of X produced in the country. So we write here the monetary value of what? All final goods and services. We have seen just now the concept of the word final, which means the goods are ready to be consumed and not they are going into the further processes of production or value addition. They are ready for the consumption, and the concept of final is about to avoid the double counting. Then produced within a given territory of a country. Now we are also clear here, the territory would mean the area which represents a given nation. Suppose we are talking about the nation India. So wherever India is there, wherever the production takes place in the territory of India, it may be the land boundary, it may be the disconnected land boundary, it may be some enclaves which we may be owning in some foreign soil. For example, before 2016, some enclaves in Bangladesh were owned by India. So production in those enclaves would be a part of India's GDP, because those enclaves, those land parcels in Bangladesh were considered to be India's mainland. And that is why the territory would be all the territory that we just discussed. Then in a given financial year, it's very obvious that we have to take a given year. We have to take a given year when we talk about the production. What would be the duration in which we calculate? So we take the financial year, which actually varies from 1st April to 31st March of the next calendar year. So suppose we in the present times, we are in the financial year 1st April 2021 to 31st March 2022. So in that financial year, in that given territory, all the final goods and services, when the monetary value is added, we get the GDP of a given country. For example, coming to India particularly, in the year 2021, for this year, when we added the production in India across 8 sectors like agriculture, which includes the farming, the poultry, the dairy, etc. We include the mining, it means mining of the various minerals, metals, etc. Then we include the manufacturing of steel, cement, car, etc. We include the electricity, we include the construction activities, we include the financial services like the banking, we include the trade, tourism, hotels and other services, as well as the services generated by the government agencies, the public administration. If we add the production by in all these sectors, we get a value. And suppose we for this year wish to calculate the production value. So suppose we got to know that in agriculture for this year, for example, 10 lakh crores of monetary value of final goods, food grains, the milk, the eggs, meat, etc. was produced. Suppose in the mining we got to know that the coal, uranium and other bauxite, etc., the production was of say 5 lakh crores. Similarly, we added the production into agriculture, mining, manufacturing, electricity, construction, banking, insurance, the tourism, trade, and the public administration. So in actual, the production in the country for this year stood at 195 lakh crores in rupees. This is the actual value of the GDP in the country for this year. Now what have we done? We have actually suppose took, coming to example of say agriculture. So what we have done, suppose we produced the wheat say 10 kgs, and we got to know that the wheat's price, the current prices of this year was say 10 rupees per kg. So we can say the production or the contribution by agriculture stood at 100 rupees. So this was actually a part of, or this is a part of the GDP. So whatever production was made, we took the volume of production, we converted into the price value, the monetary value, by multiplying the price of that year in which we wish to calculate. So suppose we can, if we see the GDP, can I say the GDP of a given year can be seen as the quantity of production in that year across these 8 sectors into the price of the year for which we are willing to calculate the GDP. So the GDP for 2020-21 can be seen as the quantity of the goods and services across 8 sectors produced in the year 2021 into price of all those commodities. Suppose we take this year's price. So this is the GDP which is known as the nominal GDP. See, why nominal? The point is, this is the year for which we are going to calculate the GDP. Can I say this is a current year, this is the production in the current year, and this is the current prices. This is the current prices, the prices for the current year. So when the GDP is calculated for a given year at the current prices, we get a concept called nominal GDP. So we can say the GDP at the current prices is called the nominal GDP, right? So suppose we are willing to calculate the GDP for this year. So quantity of this year, of course, and the price of this year. This will give me the concept called nominal GDP. So based upon this concept, suppose we calculated the GDP for this year. This is the data we got, that this was the nominal GDP. This was the nominal GDP for the year 2021 by multiplying the quantity of this year into the prevailing market prices of the same year. So friends, one, we have seen so far about the basic definition and the data of the GDP. Now, what was our GDP in the last year? See, 2019-20 and 2020-21. In this year, our GDP was close to 203 lakh crores, and in this year our GDP due to the COVID has contracted, and we were left with the GDP of these many crores. Now usually we do what? We talk the GDP in the dollar terms because we try to compare them with the world GDP. So what we do, when we take this GDP we divide with the currency exchange rate. Suppose in this year, for example, the $1 was equal to rupees 70. So when we divide this rupees by the currency exchange rate, we get into the dollars, and similarly for this year also we calculate the GDP in the dollar terms by dividing the rupee terms into the dollar terms. So for 2019-20 India's GDP, the nominal GDP stood at 2.9 trillion. It is trillion dollars, and whereas the GDP for 2020 stood at 2.834 trillion dollars. And we got to know that the GDP contracted by more than 7% from as compared to the year 2019-20. So from this year we saw a contraction in this year due to, of course, the COVID issues. The factories were closed, services were closed, investments were not made, and as a result we saw a contraction in the GDP. So friends, one thing is here, that the GDP of India for this year stood at 2.834, and the country having the highest GDP volume, or the number, is the USA with more than $21 trillion. After USA it is China with 15 to 16 trillion dollars, and after that we have the Japan, France, Germany, UK, and then India. So for this year, as per the IMF data, India's GDP ranked 7th in the world after USA, China, Japan, Germany, France, and UK. Now friends, from here we proceed to some more concepts of the GDP. Let's see one by one. Suppose we talk about 2-3 years. Suppose we talk about 2018-19, we talk about 2019-20, we talk about 2020-21. Assume that in all these years the quantity of the production was same, and assume that only the wheat was produced in these 3 years. So 10 kgs of wheat was produced, 10 kgs, and here too 10 kgs of wheat was produced. The price of the wheat in this year, suppose, was 10 rupees per kg. In this year it, due to some issue, due to some shortfall, increased to rupees 12 per kg, and suppose in this year the prices increased to 13 per kg. Now when you try to calculate the nominal GDP that we know for this year, so this year's GDP would be what? This year's GDP would be, when we multiply this quantity with the price, is it not? So we have the GDP at rupees 100 here. In this part we have the GDP as rupees 120, and here we have the GDP as rupees 130. Is it not surprising that despite having the same volume of production, we are having the GDP data at the higher sides for the 3 years? And that is why we are damn sure that this GDP may not represent the actual value of production due to the price rise. Due to the price rise, we are looking at the GDPs has increased without the change in the production. That is why we have to find the real GDP. Now what is the real GDP? In the first discussion we saw that there was a term called the base year. When we saw the discussion on the territory and the goods, we had this term called base year. Now what is the base year? Suppose we talk about the 3 years, we talked about 3 years. Now in these 3 years, it is possible that the production in this year represented the actual potential of the economy, it is possible that the potential of the economy was equal to 10 kilograms and the prices of this year represented the actual prices which would have been achieved if there was not much disruption, there was a constant production, there was no say climate change, there was no shortfall in the agriculture, etc. So it is possible that due to the normal production, due to the constant production, the prices of the wheat was 10 rupees per kg, but in the next year and the next year after that, it is possible that due to the increase in the population, because year on year population would increase and the production did not increase accordingly. The point may be that production was supposed to have increased, but it has not increased. As a result, the prices went up. So these prices are not actually representing the actual price levels in the economy, maybe due to the fall in the monsoon levels, due to some issues in the agriculture, in the industries, etc. So it is possible, it is probable that in such some years the prices may not represent the real potential of the economy, and that is why we choose a year as the year where we find the prices are comparatively stable, and that year is chosen as the year, as a base year for to make the future and the further comparisons. We cannot make a comparison. Suppose we take one more example. 2011, we have a year 2011-12. We have one year called 2011-12, 2013-14, 2016-17, etc. It is possible that in this year quantity of production was 10 kilograms and the price in this year was also rupees 10 per kg. As a result, the GDP was at 100 rupees. Next year, due to some issue in the production fell to say 8 kgs. But when the production fell and the population increased, the price may have increased, and say the price increased to 15 rupees per kg, which made the GDP at 120 rupees. And similarly, suppose the next year production shot up to 12 kilograms and the prices fell to rupees 9 per kg. Still what we have the GDP at 108 rupees. Here too you see we have the nominal GDP calculated, because nominal GDP is the GDP of that year at the same year's market prices. So the GDP for this year, the production for this year at this year's price is the nominal GDP. We can see that despite production falling, the GDP has increased, and despite production having increased, GDP has fallen, and that is why the nominal GDP at times do not represent the actual value of production in the economy, and that is why we talk about one more concept called the real GDP. We take a year as a base year for the future comparison. Suppose we say that the price of this year is something representing the stability in the economy, stability in the prices, and that is why we take this year as the base year. And when we take this as a base year, what we find, this price would be our constant prices. This is our constant prices, because this would be a price which is now being fixed for the future comparisons and the understandings of the real amount of GDP. See, these are the current prices, the prices for the current year. Suppose we talk about this year, so this year's current prices rupees 9 per kg, and the GDP at the current prices is called the nominal GDP. But when we fix this year as the base year and this price as the constant price, now we wish to calculate the real GDP. The real GDP of any year, assuming we are going to calculate the real GDP for the year 2016-17, it means the quantity of 2016-17 would be taken, but the price would not be of the same year. The price would be taken of the base year. So price of 2011-12, which is the base year. So the prices of the base year are called the constant prices. Price of the base year is called the constant price, and the production at that constant price will give me the real GDP. So suppose we wish to calculate the real GDPs for these 3 years. So this is the base year. In this base year, this is the price, this is the quantity. So for this year, the real GDP is equal to the nominal GDP. Coming to this year, production of 8 kilograms, the nominal GDP is 120, but the real would be 8 into the base year price. So GDP of this year, the real GDP would be rupees 80. And coming to this year's real GDP, so this is the production in 16-17, this is the base year prices, the constant prices, and that is why the real GDP for this year would be 120 rupees. Now if you look at the real GDP's trend, you will find that when the production fell, the real GDP also fell. When the production increased, the real GDP also increased, which was not the case with the nominal GDP, because in the nominal GDP, when the production fell, GDP increased. When the production increased, the GDP fell. So the real picture may not be shown by the nominal GDP, but the real picture of the production is more visible, more evident by the real GDP data, which we can look at here. So friends, if I summarize them, what I find is, I find that the GDP can be calculated at 2 levels. One is the current prices, which is the price of the current year in the discussion, in the focus, and we can also calculate the GDP for at the constant prices. It means prices of base year. So suppose the GDP for this year is to be calculated. So the nominal GDP would be quantity of this year into price of the same year, whereas the real GDP would be equal to quantity for this year into price of the base year, which is actually 2011-12. So friends, this is about the nominal GDP and the real GDP. Now friends, we proceed ahead to some more concepts about the GDP. Like, we have so far covered the GDP definition and of course the data for India and the world in the GDP. We have seen the real GDP and the nominal GDP. Before going ahead, let's see who publishes the GDP data and what is the frequency. You see, we have a Ministry of Statistics and program implementation, which is called as the MOSPI. This ministry has two wings. One is the statistics wing, which calculates the stats and compiles them. Other is the wing which looks after the data regarding the various programs implemented. So other wing is program implementation wing. This is the statistics wing. This wing often is called as the NSO, the National Statistics Office. Under this NSO, we have an office called Central Statistics Office, CSO. It is the CSO which calculates and publishes the GDP data. What is the frequency? The CSO calculates the data by calling the data from the 8 sectors we discussed, from agriculture, from mining, from industries, manufacturing, construction, trade, hotels, tourism, public administration, and other financial services. So from those 8 different sectors, the data is called for, and the GDP is calculated on a quarterly and the annual basis. It means for every 3 months and for every year we have the GDP data. For example, we have in a year, suppose we are into the year 1st April 2021 to 31st March 2022. So April, May, June is the quarter 1. July, August, September is the quarter 2. October, November, December, quarter 3. Jan, Feb, March is quarter 4. So GDP is actually calculated for all the quarters, and after the year is over, they are compiled and we get the GDP for the whole year. Now when we compare the GDPs of the 2 different years or the 2 different say quarters, we get the GDP growth rate. So what, suppose I say we have the 2 years, we have the years like 2019-20, we have the year of say 2020-21, and we have the year 2021 and -22. So how we can study the GDP? Let's see. Suppose in this quarter and in this year, the GDP was say rupees 100 for this quarter of 1920, and suppose the next year in the same quarter the GDP fell to rupees 76. So can I not find out that what is the change in the GDP? Yes, we can do. The point is, if you see the actual data that was published in the first quarter of this COVID year, the India's GDP for the first quarter contracted by more than 24%. The reason was the GDP in the first quarter was 100, for example, and the GDP in the next quarter was at rupees 76. So the percentage wise, the contraction was more than 24%. That's why we say in the first quarter we had the contraction. And suppose, see, as of now, as of today, we are on the 30th of September, right? It means we are actually on the last day of the quarter 2. So far we have the data of the quarter 1. So it is found that the GDP for this year's first quarter has expanded by more than 20%. It means, suppose the GDP for this year's first quarter is actually, for example, say 93 rupees. So we can say that as compared to the previous quarter of the previous same quarter of the previous year, the change is more than 20%. So this is how you see in the newspapers that the GDP has expanded by 20% or contracted by 24%, because we compare the two different years for the same quarter, and then after having comparing we suppose have all the data, then we can say for this year the GDP was say 2 lakh crores, the next year it fell down to 195 lakh crores, and that's how we have the whole estimation of the GDP for the 2 consecutive years. But before we release the data for the year, we have the data for the quarters, and we study the quarterly change in the GDP. So in the year 2021, the first quarter of this year saw a contraction of more than 24%. The next quarter of this year saw a contraction of say more than 7.3%, and as a whole also the GDP in the year 2021 saw a contraction of more than 7.3%. So we had the contraction because we have compared this year from this year. So friends, I hope I am clear and you are also clear. You understood the concept of the GDP growth rate and who publishes the GDP data. Now friends, we first come to the discussion on the GNP, then we shall come to the discussion of the GDP factor cost. Now suppose we talk about the concept of GNP. Let's see how can we reach to that data. Assume that there is an economy and there is a factory as a non-living entity in that economy. So we have this economy and we have this factory. In the factory, when the production takes place, the production takes place due to some factors. They are called the factors of production. And we have the 4 factors of production: the land, the labor, the capital, and the entrepreneur. The land is given to the factory on which it is based. The labor is supplied through which the works are done. The capital is given to buy machinery, to say create the structures, to purchase the raw material, etc. And these all components, the land, labor, capital, are managed by a person called entrepreneur, who undertakes all these activities for a profit. Without him or her, production will not take place. Suppose we have the land, we have the labor, we have the capital, but who will take this risk to bring them together, to harmonize them, to have a useful production? So from this economy or from this society, the land is supplied to the factory. From this society, labor is supplied to the factory. From this society, capital is supplied to the factory, and from this economy, someone as entrepreneur also starts the factory. So these are the factors of production. But why? Why these things would come to factory? Because the factory will pay the economy a rent for the land it has borrowed or it has taken on rent. It will pay the labor the wages for the work they have done. It will pay the banks or the institutions paying capital, say, interest on the money these people have lent to the factory as capital, and the entrepreneur will take his or her profit, without which he or she will not work for this whole activity. So, factors of production will generate wages, interests, profits and the rent. These would be the income of this economy, and this, the rent, the profit, the interest and wages would be the factor cost at the level of the factory. Factor cost means the cost at which the production is taking place. The cost at which production takes place is called the factor cost. It does not include any taxes. It includes only the rent, profits, interest and the wages. So, factor cost is the cost at the level of the factory at which production takes place. And suppose in India, the factory produces a commodity of rupees 10. How is that price determined? The price comes through the cost the factory has been bearing on the rent, profit, interest and the wages. So, if rupees 10 is the cost of production, and suppose 1000 such pieces are produced, so 10 rupees is the price per commodity, the factor cost, and 1000 such products are produced. So, can I say that the total production in the economy is equal to rupees 10,000, and the value of the production is called the factor cost, the GDP. So, can I say this is equal to the GDP at factor cost, because this is the value of production, total production, and this production takes place at a cost which is the factor cost, and that is why this is called GDP at factor cost. This is important to understand the concept of national income and the GNP. Now, this money is paid to the economy or the society. Now, understand this point. How do we reach to the GNP? GNP is a concept. See, so far we have talked about the GDP. GDP is the production value of the production made in the country by anyone. Any Japanese company making production in the country will add to India's GDP. It does not matter, GDP does not take care who is making the production. GDP is all about the where of the production. Who is making the production is a different concept, and that is why we talk about the concept called the GNP. Suppose I reach to the old definition of GDP. Have a look. We talked about the concept of the GDP. Suppose I replace this word domestic by the word called nationals. The gross national product is called the GNP, and GNP is actually the sum total of the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced by nationals of a country anywhere in the world, that is in a given financial year. The sum total of the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced by the nationals of a country in a given financial year is actually the country's GNP. So GNP is about the production by nationals. It doesn't matter where the production has taken place. Suppose we shall look at this GNP for the today's video in some short form, then we shall proceed in the next video about the GNP. Suppose in India the production is made by the foreigners and the Indians. So can I say that GDP of India is I plus F, production by Indians and production by the foreigners. Suppose I talk about the GDP of America. In America, the production by Americans and the production by, say, Indians. So GDP of USA would be equal to A plus I. Now suppose I wish to, or say this is I1, and suppose I wish to calculate the GNP of India. It means what? The total production by Indians across the world including India. So can I say the GNP would be actually I plus I1. I means the production of Indians in India, and I1 the production of Indians abroad. So can I say I plus I1 is India's GNP, that is the sum total of monetary value of all final goods and services produced by nationals of a country in a given financial year is the GNP. So we need to now calculate the actual value of I plus I1, which we should be discussing in the next video. So friends, please watch the next video in which we shall talk about in detail about the GNP, NFIA, GDP factor cost, market price and other concepts. Thank you.